Hello, everybody. We'll get started now. Well, first of all, thank you for joining us. My name is Mara González Palacios. I'm the Associate Director for Special Collections at the Arts Library at Yale University. And I would like to start by respectfully acknowledging the land that I occupy as this ancestral lands of the Quinnipiac, the Pigosset, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples. Angelica Gallegos, who graduated last year from the MArch program at Yale, created this map, which is available from the School of Architecture Tribal Land Acknowledgement page. Angelica graciously agreed to let me use her work, and I would like to tell you about the intention of this drawing. So this is an interpretive map that presents interconnected boundaries of tribal land over time and their relationship to the New Haven area. The orthogonal lines coming from the west, north, and east connect the center of New Haven's 9-square grid and indicate the historical Quinnipiac travel routes that link the Quinnipiac with the Pegossets, Wang, Mattabesset, Hamonasset, and Niantic peoples. The topography lines above the 9-square grid represents Hobomok Mountain, now known as Sleeping Giant. Hobomok Mountain is a landmark and a significant place within Quinnipiac origin stories and connect with surrounding New Haven topography history. So I'll just a few words about this exhibition. So Miko McGinty and I first conceived this exhibition in 2019 as part of Yale's commemoration of the 50th anniversary of co-education in Yale College and the 150th anniversary of women students at the university. Hillary has posted a link to more information about the exhibition, but it highlights works by women who graduated from the graphic design program, which was the first graphic design program in the United States. So just a couple of housekeeping. We will save questions for the end. The Q&A will be at the end. And also to remind you that this session is being recorded, and we will be sharing it on the YouTube channel for the Yale Library afterwards. So I'll just jump right into this first panel on women in graphic design. So first, thank you to Alicia and Rebecca for joining me. This is really great. And we will be talking about what can a graphic design career be. We thought we would start with each of them telling us how they got where they are right now. So just telling us a little bit about their career path. Alicia, do you want to start?
Okay, that's kind of a big question. But first, I want to thank Miko for just helping, give visibility to this kind of aspect of Yale and the graphic design program, and Tamara, of course, for spearheading the display, which, I'm sad to not see in person, but happy to at least see the slideshow there too. So thank you both, because I know there's a lot of effort in the curation, the display, but also the programming aspect too. So happy to participate. I guess how I got to this moment now, I would rather maybe start just sort of how I came to graphic design. And that's also kind of a short form being, I was really nothing close to a graphic designer for many years. In undergrad, I went to Barnard as an English major and dance major. I liked maps. I didn't really know what graphic design was, and then kind of fell into information design and sort of recognized that that was part of graphic design. So I kind of literally, I think, stumbled into the Yale program insofar as I was like friendly with Michael Rock and Pamela Hovland, who encouraged me to apply. And I had quite literally nearly nothing in a portfolio. But, thanks to the preliminary program and that structure, I found myself, in New Haven and, realizing with some euphoria that this was what I really loved doing, but with some horror that I had zero training for it. So it was, I won't sugarcoat it. It was pretty rough ride, and both the most stimulating and the most arduous thing I've ever done. After that, I worked for the Cooper Hewitt Museum briefly, and then I worked for Method, which is based in San Francisco and then New York, as sort of an interactive studio, and then formed management design with two other classmates from the Yale prelim program. And that has evolved, and it is now in its, I think, 22nd year, we might want to call it. And Sarah is still running the studio based in Brooklyn, and I'm now 1 year into being the head of design at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So that's where I am at this moment. So I would toss it to Rebecca.
Thanks, Alicia. And I want to echo Alicia's appreciation for all the work that Miko, Mar, Hillary, and others have done to just, include our voices in this. It's an honor, and I'm just very excited to be here. So my career path actually has quite a lot of relationship with Alicia's. It's sort of gone like this, along some similar paths. I also started as an English major. So I also started from a place that was not graphic design. And so I kind of think of my entry to graphic design as coming through books, because I just fell in love with books and the book form. And I just enjoyed the practice, and I always did it for my job while I was in school studying literature, not graphic design, not art or anything. And when I graduated, I realized, like, oh no, I want to be a designer. And I have trained zero. So I started to get interested in book design, and I wrote to some book designers, and I said, I think I want to be a book designer. How should I do this? Should I go to grad school? What should I do? And one of them said, come work for me. It was Mary Mendel. She ran the design department at Duke University Press, which is a really well-regarded university press. And I designed books for 5 years. And that was kind of how I got the foundations of typography and image making and, tying form to content and all of that. And I won a bunch of awards, and I thought, this is great. My career is going to take off. And then I realized that didn't matter at all. They weren't fulfilling, and I had to find something else. And so through my reading and looking at art, I noticed that people who were making interesting work and art projects out there maybe had met in grad school. And I thought I would go to grad school and meet some friends that I could make some work with. And that is what I did. So I went to Yale. I was in the 2-year program, even though I did not have a graphic design degree. I somehow weaseled out of the prelim year, basically just saved myself some tuition, and did the 2-year program, graduated in 2007. And from there, I went to New York City and embarked on sort of a day career at the Whitney Museum, where I had a role very similar to Alicia's. I was head of design, but I started that department, didn't exist when I got there, and it exists now today. They make amazing work. And that was what I did during the day. And at night, I did other types of design and curatorial practice. So I worked on a gallery downtown with my colleague Gimenez. I worked on books and other publications with my colleagues in We Have Photoshop. And I just did design and art all day and all night. And then my career changed when I kind of completed my work at the Whitney, and I moved from the cultural sector to the private sector. I joined IA Collaborative in Chicago, which is a design innovation consultancy, and my career changed and became more less about like design and identity, and more about applying design to strategic problems. And that work led me to the role I have today, where I am, again, similar to at the Whitney, where there wasn't a graphic design team before. I'm now at Airbnb, where I'm helping to create a service design function that where their service design has occurred, but I'm just helping to organize and accelerate those efforts.
Great, thank you. So the next, it's kind of like a bundle of questions around change. So thinking about how has your work changed over the years, and also what do you want your design work to do, like to affect change in what or how?
Rebecca, I think you should unmute yourself because
Yes.
I don't, and I'm
I am
thinking
off mute.
whoever comes up with the answer first can go.
I feel like I've experienced a ton of change in my own work, and then sort of separate but related, I feel like I've seen a ton of change in design. And so for me, I think moving from the cultural sector where I had worked for my entire career into the private sector was like a big kind of move into the unknown. And I think that maybe I had gone into that with some, or I maybe started out with some maybe kind of idealistic or somewhat simplistic ideas about like moral purity in the cultural sector, and like the private sector is just like, you know, profit motive and things like that. And I found it to be very much more complicated on both sides. And I found a kind of freedom in the private sector that I never would have expected to as a young person. So that was not necessarily like a change per se, but it was a surprise for me, and it was a change in my perspective. And then what I've seen in the design field is I feel that more and more, it's a very exhilarating time to be a designer, because so much is asked of us in terms of, you know, how are we being responsible to our users and to our society and to, you know, kind of ecological sustainability, social sustainability, things like that. These are the types of questions that I don't feel were really being asked of me when I first started 100 years ago. And so I think it's exciting to see all of that come into the conversation, both in the work I do every day and then in the larger conversation about design.
I think for me, the concept of change was, I mean, I think when I first graduated, I was just like raring to go. And I did love the environment aspect of exhibition design. So, you know, within that, museums were a natural extension. So that was a nice first place to land. But I think the evolution and the leap that I took with Ariel Apt and Sarah Gephardt into forming our own studio, you know, and we would say this when we would present as management, it's not like you sort of conceive of this studio and you like set up your shingle and you sit there and wait for the phone to ring. It was just more because, like Rebecca, like you work your day job and then you work your night job because it's like the fun stuff, or you're collaborating with your friends and that kind of stuff. And just to say that that sort of evolved in those moments of inflection where you're like, oh, I think this is enough because I was working like 15 jobs and my brain was exploding, that like maybe you should decide to commit to this venture, which was just really more like a very robust hobby. So that was definitely a moment of change to embrace that. And then, you know, then there's micro changes along the way of just sort of evolving an independent practice, which has all the benefits of flexibility and yada, yada, but you don't often use it because it's your ass on the line a lot of the time. So, you know, you work extra hard. So I always had curiosity about being in-house or working for larger institutions, but I also was able to satisfy, you know, my own desire for variety by sort of dipping into different institutions on a project base, but with a regular group and that kind of stuff. So just to say, change happens at many different scales throughout everybody's life journey. But I think it's interesting, and I enjoy the sort of parallels and sort of intersections of Rebecca's path and my own too. But fundamentally, it's just sort of the same journey as you're also learning about how you like to work, how you like to be a designer with a capital D or a small d. And just one follow-up, I would just say that I knew that from working, I liked the problem solving part. I like the dialogue with clients who may not know how to get there, but they kind of knew what the end result would be. And I was really happy to strategize in that way. And super fortunate to have, you know, a stellar work wife in Sarah Gephardt who would take the baton from that moment. But that's another area where sort of incremental change, we're kind of realizing like, I actually really enjoy this part, which is also design. It just may not be like the fancy design. So, Barb, you tell us if we're really answering things. We're just like, meh, meh, meh.
I'm also curious about what do you want design to change? Like what do you want it to do? And I know it's a big question and kind of abstract.
What do we want it? What should it do? I think just kind of to go a little bit further on some of the things I touched on earlier. So the work that I do now that I'm working at it. So Alicia, similar to you, I had always worked in smaller kind of settings, and it's really exciting to be working at like kind of a huge scale. That was something that I was never drawn to as a young person. I just wanted to like work on, wherever I could have the most impact, but somehow that has led me to this place where the scale of what I'm able to impact is really big, and that's very exciting. And it does confer a lot of, it really gives me both a sense of huge responsibility and like almost like a sense of peace, where I'm like, oh, there's so much to be solved here, and there's no way that one person could ever solve it. And so I feel like a little bit like at peace that I'm never going to be able to handle it all. And so what I have been doing in my practice is really trying to focus on creating space for a lot of other people to contribute knowledge and expertise. Because I feel like the role of design is really changing and diversifying. And that happens to be an area where my own like interest in practice, it turns out, are able to kind of like open the door to people who might not be, designers per se or have design in their name, but really their work and their knowledge and their contributions very much shape the end product and the end user experience. And so that's kind of where I've been focused. I don't know if it answers your question directly, Mar, but that's been my way of trying to create a change in design.
I think in this, I have a similar answer insofar as kind of debunking, the myth that doesn't exist holistically, but maybe in a place like where I'm sitting, where it's been around for a while. Design can solve many things, but they can't solve everything. And so I think it's sort of, in a way, you're working at opposite angles, where you're trying to sort of both contain expectations for what design can do, but also reinforce that design is useful for so many things. So I think the key to getting that dialogue and that engagement going is, I think Rebecca's alluding to this too, sort of early collaboration. Many voices early on can be kind of chaotic, but if people can respect the role of design and where it's appropriate, and that requires ambassadors like us, ambassadors like people listening here too, because I think people can maybe know what design is, but there's so many ways that it's not as flashy or as whatever is what people may expect. So, I think in a way, the positions that we're both in, we can evangelize in a higher level, but also, teach by example, like demonstrate how we are structuring our teams and how we're working within big organizations so that people can sort of trust us. Versus seeing us as sort of like the last stop on some train where content development happens and you just give it to design, it just sort of happens. So that's the bigger picture, I think, too. And I guess I would also add, in terms of changing it down to the designers too, having some sense of that collaborative spirit, but also some humility that, in a way, yes, we may have the better eye, we know color, we've all taken John Gamble's type class, but, hear people out. They have their own sensibilities, and sort of, there is a level of compromise that maybe you don't get taught that in school because you're so focused on expressing your own ethos and sensibility as a designer. But that is something I think one learns with experience, just sort of, it's how one gets through in a professional environment. So that's just one thing I would note.
Yeah, I think there's a trust the process aspect to what you're talking about, where it's like the times when I feel that it's a struggle, or times when I have a fixed sense of what the outcome should be. And then the times when I feel like things are moving and that there's momentum are the times when I'm a little bit more focused on what the process is and how to create an inclusive environment for others. And like the end result could be, there's like a lot of right answers. I say that all the time. There's a lot of right answers. And I think that there's things that lead to both of those paths that aren't necessarily wrong. I think there's right times for each of those paths as well. So knowing when you want to invite all those voices in versus knowing when you don't, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, so I'm also wondering, can you think of, like in hindsight, have there been any decisions that have been like pivotal to how you have progressed in your career? Specific moments or not really?
Okay, do you want to go?
Me?
Moment?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I will return to a moment that I mentioned earlier, which is when I left New York, and so many different life and career things converged at one moment. And I think that that is like an important thing to remember, is that there's never just one path, and so many different things impact your path. But for me, my project at the Whitney was completing, like literally the board had just approved the identity, and I got into a U-Haul and drove away. So it was very like epic. And then I'd had a baby, and my husband and I, our families are all in Chicago. We lived in New York, our families were all here. So we moved, and I found this company, IA Collaborative. I actually found it for him because he's more of a, you know, coming from Yale, like kind of like user-centered design thinking and all that kind of, was sort of a different religion.
Right.
And wasn't really my area, but it was his. And so I found it for him, but he had a different job. And through actually a colleague from Yale, Forrest Young, I got sort of reconnected with IA myself. And it really fulfilled something in me that I had been looking for and craving, which is sort of like an MBA to go with my MFA. And it's not because I felt that the MFA was incomplete. It's that, I don't know, I just wanted to be able to like try on another way of thinking. And I felt like there were all these invisible forces that impacted the outcome of the design. And I just wanted to understand them better. That was really all it is. And so I think it was just like pursuing that curiosity and trusting it was probably the biggest change for me. Mar, I don't know if that was exactly, or an important decision to follow that. Because when I came here, there were other opportunities in the cultural sector that I could have pursued. And I just kind of was like, I'm going to try this other thing and take a leap.
I think that I'm not going to answer your question for a second. Just to say that I think that's a good testimony to like being open to different environments, even though the subject matter may sound like a turnoff or whatever. Like I always tell, like, you know, recent grads to, you know, don't write off like big ad agency type thing, even though it's sort of like evil empire sounding, because it may be a really great core group of people that you're working with in a larger institution that maybe is more financially stable. You can make better bank, but your dynamic every day could be really great. So you'll learn that you like smaller teams, like that's all going to work. It's not really actually just about the work. It's sort of like how you do it. So I think that is something I always espouse, but you know, I was not stuck, but like with my own studio for so long. So I think one of my, obviously a big inflection point was leaving management to come here with the full support, I will say over and over, with Sarah, but it was definitely a moment for us to both kind of reflect and see, like, you know, what was the next chapter for management? What was the next chapter for Sarah? What was the next chapter for me? So, and then you flash backwards a million years. And I think the other big moment for decision is like applying to Yale. Cause I literally was just sort of like taking class at SVA. I was like, yeah, I don't know what this thing is. Like, it just sort of, I got plopped in the middle of New Haven, and that was, you know, kind of a sink or swim moment, but it taught me a lot. So you don't see these things coming, though. I will say to this whole audience, you know, young or old. So you just ride with it, and it just roll with the punches, I would say, as we all have for these past 2+ years, whatever.
No doubt.
So you've already mentioned some of the ways in which your time at Yale influenced like the connections you've made and other things, but are there other ways and you can think that that time at Yale was, how did it influence your career, or how you have approached design?
Kick it to you now, Alicia. You get to go first.
Well, this is one of those moments you're like, it made me what I am today. It kind of freaking did, because I knew nothing, and I only, and not to say I came out like a total, Yale fan. It was just more that was the community that that nurtured me and taught me everything I know. And I will always shout out to Barbara Glauber, who was in her first year of teaching the prelims, my first year as a prelim. So I think that was just like a fundamental formative experience for me, to learn from teachers like her, from Michael, from Paul Elliman, from John Gamble, Sheila, of course. And, at the time you're just like, all right, this is just what I'm here to do. But then afterwards too, just the support, and yes, it is a network in a kind of networky way, but it is sort of the community. And I was super fortunate to have like a super tight core class. We still get together pretty regularly for reunions. And so it's just, it gave a lot to me. So, and I know I'm super grateful for that. And it's not always the same, with every year is different, et cetera. So yeah, I don't know. I think if I didn't go to Yale, I would be, I don't know, maybe doing some journalism stuff, but still, I think I would just sort of be still in the sort of gravitational pull of design, if it wasn't for Yale. So Rebecca.
I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't gone to Yale. I never thought about. I just was asking,
like,
it was such a big deal for me to get in. And
did you apply to other schools, I should ask?
I did, and I didn't get in anywhere else.
I didn't apply to other schools because that's how, like, I'm like, what is this art school thing? Okay, fine. Like, I wasn't looking.
Yeah, I got the idea that I wanted to go to grad school, and I looked at all the schools. I got every catalog, and the one that I wanted to go to was Yale. I remember there was like no pictures, there's no color. It was just like words, and it was super serious. And I was like, that is the school for me. And I was like, of course it's Yale. Nobody in my family has ever gone to an Ivy League school. Like, I'm a first generation American. Like, this is not going to happen. So I applied to all of those schools, and Yale was the only one that let me in, which was, looking back on it, it's just so odd. I was very lucky. But I think the things I took away, the biggest things I took away are that, similar to you, Alicia, I had a very tight-knit class. It was a very safe space to fail. Psychological safety is like the buzzword these days. Well, everything I learned about psychological safety, I learned at Yale. And it was cool because my class was really, we pushed each other, but it was also very, very safe. And then, we kind of like were in the vantage point of other classes who were maybe like a little bit more like competitive, or a little bit more, just had different,
yeah.
None of them bad, but just kind of different flavors. And just with that, I felt like I just got into the exact right, cohort for me and what I needed to learn. And then, everything I've ever made since then, I think about, is this in a form language that would mean something to my colleagues there, even if they're never going to see it, which they probably aren't.
Although I don't know about you,
that filter's always there,
I can also speak to my fellow classmates that certain assignments you never forget. They're like from prelim year Xerox type of stuff, but we, get together and it's so vivid, it's shocking. So not to put too much stress on those who are engaged in the program, with like, it really sinks in the frontal lobe forever.
Really does.
If you think about challenges, I mean, what do you think are let's not put it just as challenges and opportunity, like the main challenges and opportunities that you see coming into your work, or into the field of graphic design?
Sort of two questions, maybe. Challenges in our work and then challenges in design is sort of separate. I mean, related, but.
You're asking, Mar, you cut out for me for 1 second. So I just want to make sure I understand the question. You're asking about what are the biggest challenges and opportunities that we see in our work today?
Yeah.
Or graphic design, whichever path you want to tackle.
Yes, you get to choose what version of the question
I feel like my path in graphic design have like what I have to say about graphic design is so informed by my own path. Because if I had stayed on a path that was more like I'm doing pure graphic design, I feel like I have a different thing to say. So Alicia, I feel like you should go first.
No. Okay. I will only say that I always feel reluctant to sort of comment on graphic design as a whole, not only because it's like an enormous task,
Yeah.
but also because I don't know, I credit the fact that I kind of I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool graphic designer. And I know this for a fact, knowing more graphic designers who are far more committed to things like just the perfect details of this and that. And like, my threshold of really going down with any decision is super low. So I will, say uncle very early in the spirit of sort of, collaboration, compromise, however you want to call it. So I recognize the rigor and the sort of specificity of how our tribe operates. But that's why I kind of feel myself a little bit at a distance. And where I am now, I actually really enjoy the fact that I don't have to pick the typefaces because I have a team of people out there who are awesome. And my job is to advocate for them and, advocate their role within this institution. And sort of, it's not to say that I'm like elevated, but I'm just at a level where it is more strategic, it is more planning. And, people will ask, do I miss that day to day? And I'll tell you here, like, I don't.
Just
So,
among us friends.
Exactly. Whoever else is out there in the ether.
Can't even see who else is out there.
But, it all relates to our conversation. If that change, that realization, that moment of just like, oh, I kind of like this, just planning part. And still being engaged, but not being the one to sort of be passed with that is to me a nice transition for mine. So I completely don't think I answered the question, but I will toss it back to you.
That makes me think, I'm so glad that you answered first. That makes me think of something that it's not so much a challenge, but like what I have seen a work around that to some challenges that have kind of shaped my career path. So in my previous role at IA Collaborative, a lot of the work that we did was, kind of very early stage, innovation, strategic, speculative, long before you get into the realm of where like the brand team cares what it looks like, or the marketing team has a perspective about the tone of voice or anything like that. Like we were way upstream. And so the designers had a kind of freedom because we were never being really, there was a huge portion of our portfolio that was not where we had like free reign over what things looked like. Mm-hmm. So an example might be, a company might come to us and say, like, we want to try to understand, this business question or whatever. We'd be like, we have an idea. What if we just kind of do a pop-up and just prototype a whole little business, and we can test out all these different questions that you have, and we're going to name it something else, and we're going to give it a different brand, and we're going to make it look totally different so that like we can run it, but it doesn't ever get connected to you, and it can be a little experiment. And so then the designers get to do all this stuff. They get to just come up with all these, we kind of call them thumbnail brands, where it's like we would just kind of create these little experiments, little and they got to just run free in a way that I think when I was working in much more pure graphic design, and it was like, well, let's talk, talking with the clients about like, well, what typeface is it going to be, what color, why, right. And all that kind of stuff. Like the amount of pressure and scrutiny on the design, like the fun out of it sometimes. So now that has like led me to a place in my career where I apply graphic design every single day, and it is never what we talk about. It is applied to these like abstract questions and to these conversations that people maybe don't know how to have until we have some kind of evidence in front of them. Exactly. And it's like, okay, well, now we have something to respond to, and let's just, sketch on here and things like that. And I feel like that gives me also a tremendous amount of freedom with all of that, with my design.
That's you can extrapolate that to say, like, if someone comes to you and you feel like you don't have the right information in the brief or blah, 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 like, there's any number of reasons why we can't, we want to save our time and money, but there's also a moment where you're like, you know what, it'd be so much easier if we had something to look at, to talk through, and then start there. Just to say that lowering that threshold to start the conversation through design sometimes is what you need to do. I think it's super broad here, but I think you know what I mean.
Agree with that. Mara, did we answer your question?
We're kind of off. off-roading here.
They
I
say
mean,
to
it's
answer the
so
question
great.
that you wish you were asked. That's what they tell you in media training.
I think we've done that.
So, yeah. No, I mean, but it's related. I was thinking about like, yeah, what challenges you see coming your way. But sometimes that's like, maybe it's more like what challenges are there right now? Because how do you know what's coming after?
What challenges do I see coming my way? I'm trying to grow a team. So that's
How big a team? Do you know?
No, I don't know, but it won't be, I don't think it'll be very, very big, but I think that finding people who are great visual communicators and love to apply themselves to these kind of more abstract and operational problems is, I'm pretty omnivorous in terms of where that skill set can come from, but I believe strongly in graphic design as a starting place for that skill set.
Yeah, I mean, I think myself just learning within this first year, navigating the culture of this place that, but also I've been like so loving just meeting everyone, and maybe that speaks to my, under socialized during the first pandemic wave, especially. But I love the range and depth and breadth of content that I have access to. I mean, my favorite lunches are with like the curator of Arms and Armor and the curator in Modern Contemporary. And, we just go into storerooms and it's just awesome. Oh, hi, Kat.
There's your cat.
Or, somebody who, lunch with the head of the Egyptian department. Like, so I just love those engagements. And so, that's not about design. It's just sort of like the interconnective tissue of a dynamic in any workplace. So in that way, I just find it sort of an endless font of variety and content. Challenges, of course, are what beset us all. Is trying to like navigate projects through, for me, a very complicated organization that scale is not, it makes me wish for smaller, nimble institutions like the Whitney or any other institution, because we're really big. But this is just sort of specific to our workplaces. I'm happy to redirect it if people wanted to talk about broader career stuff too.
So we had talked about before the idea of what has surprised you, and I think you've mentioned some of the things that have surprised you in your time. But I'm thinking, so it also seems to me that both of you have been very open to, not just deciding I'm going to go there, and this is how I'm going to go there. You've been like, let's see what happens. So are there other things that have been very surprising, or that, kind of, if you think of when you were finishing your graduate program, that like, would you see where you are now at all? Or is that like completely, it's something you never considered at that point?
No, but I don't know if you ever really, I never really had an image of myself, in any really role. I was just eager to sort of find out more about this field. So which is different, I think, than people who have, like, say, worked in the field and then taken a pause to go to graduate school. I think that's just a fundamentally, different approach and life experience that you bring to that experience. I will say, though, that like I didn't necessarily, we joked about it. I remember I evoke John Gamble's name a lot, it seems, but he jokingly was referring to the group of 5 women who were in my prelim class. We should start our own studio. And we're like, oh, ha, ha, ha. But it kind of happened. Like, we started with 3 of us and went down to 2 when Ariel moved to Minnesota. But that's something I would not have expected. I thought I was just going to follow different other models. So that was a surprise to me. And then, the nature of running one's own business, being, taking projects for, is it money? Is it the connections, or is it the portfolio? navigating that for as many years as we did, I think is a testament to also the strength of my connection with Sarah, and the ability, because during school we were actually really competitive, but after school was like great to be like, oh, thank God, we like we're two halves of one brain. So I was super fortunate in that way. So in a way, the surprises, as I said, like sort of were on smaller scales, but the bigger ones still surprised me. And yes, when I first heard of this job, it was not a lark totally, because, you know, I knew Susan had this role years ago and she did amazing, tough work for her brand building here. But I was like, oh, that's such a fancy job. And then as I was doing the interview process, I was like, I don't know, like this seems like this is going pretty well and I'm actually not feeling too intimidated or whatnot. Or so I think this is also age, because I'm old, but you kind of feel like suddenly you're like, hell yeah. So that's not something you think of when you're whatever graduating either. I mean, it's always good to have a healthy ego. I did not. So that's why. But Rebecca, I want to hear your side of that too.
I have the opposite, which is that I never would have imagined, as it turns out, my skills and what I do best and what I like best, it is most at home in a really big organization. And I never would have thought that. I've always worked in tiny little, you know, pockets of organizations, and the Whitney was kind of the biggest, you know, organization I'd ever worked in. And then when I went into consulting, then I was kind of plugged into these giant, you know, multinational companies. And it never was something that I was drawn to. It never was something that I was like, I think that'll be, that's where I belong at all.
That's
I just
right.
sort of was like trying different things out, and it seemed like an environment where I could try things out. Weirdly, could I just move to the next company and try out a different thing there? But then I just started to actually get interested in a certain space in travel and hospitality. I got to do some work with hotels. I got to work with Hyatt. I got to do some work with airlines, United Airlines and Air Canada. And like, I never was like, again, you know, really super excited about like working with a big company per se, but just the complexity all began to become interesting to me. Never would have expected that either. And, you know, now all of that kind of has converged where now I'm in, you know, kind of a tech travel hospitality space with a lot of complexity. And a lot of times I say that what I do is I take the complexity and I just like radically oversimplify it. It's like all these people do all this incredible work and I just try to sense make it, and I'm kind of not that smart. And so like it all comes out very simple.
I doubt that.
Because to come through this filter, it's come out simple. And I feel like those type, and it's like how to gather all that knowledge, like I said, and turn it into a single story or single point of view. You kind of need all those perspectives as the raw material. And so that's something I never would have thought before, is that I would thrive in a big organization.
Now, I think the multiple inputs is key. And what I find very stimulating, I mean, you know, that's very broad, but I think just having that environment where, you know, when you are a smaller situation, it is much more a smaller bubble, which can be very freeing for so many people. But I agree. I think I realized that I was kind of missing that in a consistent level in a way that's more not project by project as much. So.
Totally.
Great. So I think I'm gonna start getting some of the questions from the audience. Yeah, so it's shifting gears a little bit. So one of the questions is I am in my 2 years in the Yale graphic design program. I would say about 80% of my graphic design instructors have been male. Is this common design in design academia or specifically to Yale? If it is common, why do you imagine women aren't getting hired for or not wanting design teaching positions? I'm thinking also now that, well, I'll let you.
That doesn't match the experience I had, which I'm happy to say. You know, Irma and Linda and Sheila and Yulia Born and all kinds of wonderful, and it never felt like and my class wasn't overly dominated by men, and it was a very kind of, I didn't have that experience, and I can imagine if I had, it would feel yuck.
Yeah. Sorry if that person is feeling that imbalance directly. I didn't also feel it when I was in school, but that was like 99. I would also be careful that I'm sure, now more than ever, people are acutely aware of, the diversity of every faculty hire, et cetera. So, but I would say give voice to it for sure, to know that you're not a passive consumer, to sort of recognize that. And I always look for, in different programs that I've taught at, opportunities for, say, short form workshops. And then that can be a place where people get invited in to be test driven for the students. It's like a small load for time. Now you can remote in. So like little ways where you can embed more diversity. So it's not necessarily like the big tenured hire, which is arduous in a different way. But, from a student level, certainly advocating for that type of series or workshop or one day even, to sort of work with people who you're interested in working with, because you're in a school that can, an invitation from here will make it happen. So
that is such good advice.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see, well, there's the current search for a new chair, so.
Yes, no, that's a huge opportunity for sure.
Yeah.
And Sheila being the head is not, there's no shrinking violet there. So
yeah. So another question, will you tell us about the designers and people you work with at management, at the Met, at Airbnb, in your careers? There is a question here. Okay. So you were talking about the building, the team that you're building, Rebecca. Can you think of an ideal size for it?
5.
Okay.
maybe you should give your email where people can send their
Yes, at the end of this, please reach out. I'd love to meet some folks as I'm starting this journey.
Yeah, so I think the main question was about the if you can tell us a little bit about the designers and the people that you work with.
What do you want to know about? I've worked with so many inspiring people, and I bet you have too, Alicia. It's like hard to even wrap my brain around. Yeah.
I mean, not to say there's a profile, but like at management, we always look for people who were good at a lot of things. And, we're used to a small environment, but also used to like 2 art directors who often agreed, but sometimes did not. But and also really collaborative spirit, where if you started a sketch and somebody had an idea for it, like being able to give it over and not be too, fixated on ownership, which is something that Sarah and I absolutely, is because that's how we worked and we wanted that same spirit. So you're listening for people who could be a good cultural fit. Of course, talent is key, but that's sort of the first thing that gets you in the door, but it's sort of just like a vibe. And then hiring for a lot of the Met positions now for graphics, it's not an easy job, because those who come wanting to do like the full breadth and range of things that we all are trained to do, it can be kind of tough, because it's actually kind of narrow in terms of what we do. Like digital is a whole different department, and Rebecca knows full well, and certainly Hillary now at Whitney, like how you negotiate that. But it was a huge group for a huge institution, but we have to have kind of a narrow scope. So, but it's a huge depth of content. So I think for me, I've learned too about how to sort of listen for people who are keen on that aspect of this work, and those who, want a little bit more latitude, maybe are better in a smaller institution that needs somebody who can be jack of all trades. So that's just broadly what I listen for in the 2 different hiring scenarios that I've experienced.
To build on that, I look for good storytelling, because that's the one thing that, working in innovation, there were a lot of projects that we worked on where there wasn't necessarily going to be a clear outcome. It wasn't like we're going to make an app. It was like, we have this problem space and we want to try to understand a little bit about what, our opportunities are. It's very vague. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the graphic designer, honestly, to be the kind of, to sense make and turn that vagueness. I mean, it's a team effort. It's not all to the graphic designer, but that ability to like actively listen and put things down on paper and say like, oh, that wasn't right, and change it and kind of, you know, be part of that improvisational process. Not everyone likes that, and that is okay. You don't have, you know, you, as you progress in your career, you'll find that you thrive in a heads down environment, or you thrive in a highly collaborative environment where nobody stays in their lane, or a zillion other things. So, but in the kind of direction that I've gone in, it's that those folks who are kind of actively listening and designing as they're doing it is what I look for. Storytelling.
What advice would you give to someone who just graduated and is about to apply for jobs? Even after years of studies, I'm still feeling a bit insecure and questioning my actual skills, and I feel like I haven't figured out my niche.
That's okay.
I think they'd be weird if you had your niche.
Yeah. I felt actively deprofessionalized by Yale. So like to come out and feel insecure and not quite sure where you fit in is probably a sign that it worked. You know.
I would also worry less about the niche part and more about you listen for your own interests. Even just the tiniest bit, which can lead you to some company that may not need help or whatever, that'll help propel you and, you know, drive you to sort of, you know, exhibit that curiosity. And I don't want to say passion, because I think that word gets thrown around a lot, but, you know, if it starts there, that'll go a long way, unless you're offered like $1 bazillion to a soulless place that you just know you're going to hate. But that's another kind of formula to work out in one's life. So I wouldn't worry about it so much as just sort of follow, you know, make a list. I'm a big list maker of different, you know, interests you may have. It could be size of studio. It could be studios that fall into those different sizes, and sort of see what the matrix will reveal. And then just sort of, you know, I think informational interviews are always easy to ask for. People can say no and they may well. But, you know, 20 minutes of Zoom time, you know, half hour, don't ask for an hour. It's really hard. But, you know, just quick, I just like curious about what you do, that kind of stuff. People love talking about themselves. So I would approach it that way. But don't start with feeling like you're not presenting strong enough, because I don't know, I was just more like, hey, anybody hire me. So if you sense that enthusiasm from somebody, that goes a long way.
And then once you start doing the work, I felt like there a whole lot of times I would worry about what was expected of me and try to make the thing that I thought was expected of me. And that was rarely the path to a good outcome. And usually what would happen was I would try and make all these ugly things that I thought were expected of me. And then I would just stop, just be like, what would make me happy? And I would make that thing. And then that was the right thing. So, you know, kind of listening to your inner voice or whatever woo thing, you know, we want to say, I think that the confidence will come from there, but it takes a long time. So
it does. And, you know, sometimes the inner voice is like 15 different voices. So I would just say like, start with one and keep going.
Yeah.
Okay. The Yale program emphasizes the idea of a body of work. What threads, formal or conceptual or process related, are still present in your work that began or were identified in graduate school?
Collaboration and trust was definitely like what my thesis was about, and trust between client and designer, and kind of a reciprocal networked mode of working. And like it, you know, it's so totally relevant to what I'm doing today. And that thread is still there.
I'm so impressed that your thesis was about like process. Mine was just like work your ass off until you're exhausted and you're like strung out. And that would have been so counterproductive for me. And that's the downside of the graduate school experience, at least mine. Because I was going to say more geekily, like information design and systems. So, you know, complex systems and those visualizations, but also ones that are more ephemeral or physical. I did a deep dive into like dance notation and sort of like, the sort of time-based performances and that kind of how you document it. So it's still something that I'm super interested in doing, because the hilarious part about graduating from grad school and leaving your thesis behind is that you don't really leave your thesis behind, but you keep coming up with other ideas for thesis projects and like not having the time to do them. So I know that sounds like, a living nightmare to those who are enduring their program right now, but it's kind of nice because the intensity and the sort of ability to research and explore is something that I always circle back to. And the research project I did 2 years ago about printed ballots was so satisfying, and it reminded me of being in school and just that luxury, really a luxury, even though it doesn't experience like luxury, was something that I crave. So I seek it out in my downtime, which sounds so geeky, but it's true.
So we have a question from Trinity Grace, who's asking, what advice can you give a fifth grader for graphic designing and coding who wants to pursue a career in graphic design?
How old is your kid?
Fifth grader, don't you? Mine is 11. Yours is right.
Mine is a ninth grader. She's going to be 15. I know, crazy.
Is she
So
gonna be a designer?
I'm in teenage land, so I would let you go first on this one.
My fifth grader lives in Procreate, just drawing all that the pandemic caused us to, forego all Montessori type of, no technology perspective. We hand her the tablet and she's going to be a designer. Like, that's all she does. She's super into the layers and Procreate. She's just voracious. She'll copy things and then she'll let go of what she's copied and she'll apply it. And so honestly, I just think unfettered access to the tools with all of the risks, the attendant risks, I think is what we're doing.
Maybe I'm revealing my parenting skills, but I would start by saying my mother was a fine artist and she taught many years at the University of Michigan, but her advice to me and my sister were, on no uncertain terms, if it is like literally the last thing you can do not be an artist or a visual, she didn't say designer per se, but she was like, don't do this, kids, like don't do drugs. And I think I'm translating that into my daughter, who is, I acknowledge, in an arts related high school doing fine art, but I'm like, okay, don't get too comfortable, because they're all like, they go to Yale and RISD. I'm like, So I'm hoping to God she'll be like a doctor, lawyer, whatever, and like graphic design, like on a side with like really good taste. So that's my influence as a parent. So pick whichever answer you prefer.
Yeah. All ends of the spectrum are represented here.
Yeah.
Well,
and they're going to turn out the way they're going
much.
to turn out also. So.
That was a really nice question to end with, and I want to thank everyone for all your great questions, and Alicia and Rebecca for being here. And we have 2 more panels to come. The next one is on February 14th, so in 2 weeks, also on a Monday, and then the Monday after that on the 21st. I think Hilary is putting in chat the links to register for those, and we hope to see you back then. So thank you, everyone. This has been great.
Thank you, Mara and Miko, for sure, and all your efforts. The programming looks great, and I'm going to tune in for the others for sure.
Great. Have a good night.
Everything. Thanks for everything.